Hi guys, I know it's been a while from the looks of my YouTube history, maybe about 4 months since I last made a book review. I haven't stopped reading, but I have stopped at least posting reviews of books. I've been writing them and posting them in different places like Amazon and Goodreads the whole time. I just haven't actually filmed them for you and put them on YouTube. But in the last 4 months, this is what I have managed to read. It's exactly a dozen books. So, and then per the history of my channel, each one is going to get a full review. I don't do, reviews, several reviews to a video. So each one is going to get a video all of its own, 6, 8, 10 minutes, like they usually are. But I want to let you know that none of this is going to go without having been paid its due attention. So I'm going to start chronologically from when I first read them a few months ago. And I'm going to start with that book. And that book happens to be the one I have on top here, which is this. It is called The Muse Learns to Write, Reflections on Orality and Literacy from Antiquity to the Present by Eric A. Havelock. Very little, very short, interesting book of essays around a similar theme. Eric Havelock was a classics professor at Yale for a few decades, back around the middle of the 20th century. And he was one of the few people to write several books on the small set of topics that this book is about. And this book is one of the last books that he wrote in his career. It sort of sums up a lot of his perennial concerns. What that topic is, I'll mention in the body of the essay. About 28 centuries ago, roughly around the time of Homer, one of the most important occurrences in what would eventually become Europe took place. And that is the sudden evolution of the Phoenician syllabary into the full Greek alphabet that we know today. Before this time, absolutely all information had to be transmitted orally. It was spoken, from contracts between parties to how to become a Greek citizen to knowledge of everything from complex family genealogies to how to engage on the battlefield. All of this had to be spoken because you couldn't write it. There were two scholars back in the early 20th century by the name of Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who together proposed an idea which would have allowed all pre-literate poets like Homer to improvise their poetry. And it also gives a cohesive set of explanations concerning why Homeric poetry looks and sounds the way it does. Their thesis, later picked up by the likes of scholars like Walter Ong and the man who wrote this book, Eric Havelock, is called the Parry-Lord thesis. Parry, P-A-R-R-Y, Lord, L-O-R-D. The Muse Learns to Write is Havelock's last major work, like I said, and mostly a book-length meditation, a short book-length meditation on the Parry-Lord thesis and its implications in history and writing. It's also a summa, which tries to recapitulate an entire career's worth of ideas while tying up its loose ends. And because of this, its length, just under 130 pages, it really seems like a short, precursory introduction to the idea of orality. It really is far more complex than its length would initially lead you to assume. Havelock, as I said, for many years a sterling professor of the classics at Yale, is interested not so much in the shape of Homeric poetry, but rather the forms that occurred in human consciousness that were caused by the shift from orality to literacy. That is, by this historical occurrence or historical um, coming on board of the Phoenician syllabary and soon thereafter the Greek alphabet. And he's also interested in the question of how this important transition inflicts itself upon texts, and how you can see evidence of it in text, sort of deforming them or reshaping them in the image of literacy and away from the image of orality. Some questions are so important that they may almost be counted as scandalous. One of the difficulties of thinking about, this is a quote from the book, one of the difficulties of thinking about language is that you have to use language to think about it. Linguistic act is to be directed upon itself, and once written down, the act could be visualized, and this visual could be separated from the act of speaking and laid out in a kind of visual map. But what has the nature and significance of the speaking act itself? What has been its role in man's history? That question, not the importance or role of any particular spoken act, but the actual fact, the nature and significance of speaking itself, or of writing itself. Again, that transition from orality to literacy. What has been that role in our history? According to Havelock, not even the emergence of Greek philosophy escaped the influence of the orality literacy transition. He cites the unique character of Plato, whose denunciation of poetry as a form of rhetorical decadence marks a sharp break from his own written prose, a prose which, it should be noted, is highly indicative of his own background as a dramatist. Plato was actually a very hopeful dramatist before he became a philosopher, and in reading the dialogues, that's very clear. So since much of his philosophy was born of Plato's dramatic dialogues involving Socrates, we have to ask ourselves whether even the most basic presuppositions of philosophy, ideas of freedom, ideas of individuality, ideas of what it means to know, epistemological ideas, could have gone untransformed by this orality literacy transition. And I think if the answer to that is yes, that they have been transformed, I don't think it's an academic question. I think it's perhaps a very important question. Havelock goes on to present both a general and a specific theory of Greek orality, as well as looking at the work of people whose work is closely related to his own, like Marshall McLuhan, the famous Canadian communications theorist, and Harold McInnes. For a one-stop précis of Havelock's major work, this is a wonderful place to start. As I said above, this is a summa, a bringing together of all of his important work into one short collection. So it touches on a lot of ideas, especially the ones, like I said, the orality literacy break, which is, if you are interested, more fully set forth in his earlier and much more scholarly book called The Preface to Plato, which he published in 1963. So if any of this sounds interesting, and how could it not, go out and grab yourself a copy of this wonderful little book. It's called The Muse Learns to Write, Reflections on Orality and Literacy from Antiquity to the Present, by Eric A. Havelock.